Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Defence Eye podcast for this week. Interesting developments. We are counting down to the end of the UK parliamentary recess and are seeing government ministers, officials, military officers appearing in Parliament to make lots of interesting statements that they usually save up to the end of term, so to speak. Monday, we saw the Public Accounts Committee, which had a very illuminating session on the state of the MOD, the Defence Investment Plan, future spending, and most interestingly, the Ajax armoured vehicle. And we had the head of delivery at DENS, Defence Equipment Support Procurement Agency, Lieutenant General Anna Lee Riley, giving the view on the status of the Ajax programme. And it was pretty fiery stuff. I mean, she came out all guns blazing, so to speak, saying that Ajax was good to go and that all the problems were down to user issues with maintenance and operations. Fiery stuff. So far, the Ministry of Defence has not come out and endorsed that as the view of the ministers. So we wait to see if the government actually really believes what their officials and army officers are telling them. So, Francis, how can this pan out?
Well, I have to say the session talking about Ajax was slightly surreal. To hear the General Riley, say, we've just found out there are issues on track tensioning and that the operators haven't been doing things in the right way. Well, actually, you can look back at reports going back to 2021-22, and track tensioning was mentioned then. So the idea they have just found out this is an issue is, should we say, difficult to believe? And basically saying it's nothing with the vehicle, it's the operators. Patriotism is the last reserve of the scoundrel. Blaming the operators is equally the last resting place of the scoundrel. Because the first thing you can say is, okay, they weren't operating the vehicle correctly. So what had you told the operators to do as regards training? How did you train them? Because if they weren't doing it correctly, someone messed up on the training regime. And I would also just say, on a general sense, we have Health and Safety Executive Report, Institute for Naval Medicine Report, Infrastructure and Projects Authority Report, and then the Sheldon Report, all of which say there are problems with noise and vibration on Ajax. And I know it sounds like semantics. The solution announced was never a solution, it was mitigation. So it's trying to make things less bad. And it was rubber mats and different rubber on the controls and so forth. It's pretty obvious from what we've now heard about Titan Storm. But actually, if I remember correctly, Daily Telegraph, Tom Cotterill reported there were problems observed by the Household Cavalry Regiment in 2024. It's obvious that these mitigations didn't work. And let's just bear in mind, when the Defence Minister, Luke Pollard, announced the suspension of use of Ajax in November last year, he said it was for 2 weeks so that people could work out what's going on. Well, so mid-November to December, January, February, March, 4 months later, and they have not resumed using Ajax. If everything was absolutely fine and dandy, what's the problem? And the answer is there's more to this than meets the eye.
Well, it's quite interesting that Mr. Pollard was asked in Parliament about this, and he said he would be making his statement after the Easter recess. So it's not likely this issue is going to be put to bed anytime soon. And so far, the Ministry of Defence has not come out and made any comments about General Riley's statements to the committee, backing them up.
And can we put on record, we have approached the MOD and we have said, this is what the General said yesterday. Is this official policy? And the MOD has not confirmed that what she said was what is official policy. Okay, and the fact that they're also saying ministerial statement after Easter, I suspect, and it's something you've mentioned before, and dare I say, sadly, I've doubted this, Tim. You've always been saying there's the local elections and the Welsh Senate election and the Scottish Parliament election. There's a degree to which they are deferring a lot of potential bad news until after those. Though, speaking to Labour Party sources, they're saying they're going to take a drubbing in Wales, even if they didn't close Merthyr Tydfil, they're going to be slaughtered.
Merthyr Tydfil, of course, is the factory where the Ajax is assembled in the Welsh valleys, which is electorally significant in the battle for the control of the Welsh Parliament. Now that leads us into the DIP, which is another sort of hanging issue that's hanging over the Ministry of Defence. They're yet able to come to any conclusion, put it out there, which is leaving lots of people across the defence industry, the armed forces, Parliament, commentators wondering what the hell's going on.
And that is the question. What the hell is going on? What is strange is it sensible to have a defence investment plan? It used to be called the Defence Equipment Plan, and the MOD under the previous permanent secretary said the equipment plan was a waste of time because it was a snapshot in the rearview mirror and it takes us too much time, despite ignoring the reasons why it had been set up in the first place. Defence investment plan ought to have been almost cut and paste, because once you know your budget, once you know, and this was said by the National Armaments Director in another hearing, the Public Accounts Committee, and he was saying nuclear is going to be 20+%, if not a little bit more, of the defence equipment budget. It shouldn't be that difficult. Tim, let's think about this. We had the spring statement last year, which had the defence budget rising, and they were talking about the biggest sustained rise in defence spending since World War II. You then had the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, saying, we're going to go to 3% of GDP, not 2.7, 2.8%. And the figures matched with the spring statement. We both were slightly cynical coming up to the autumn budget, November. Would the figures still be the same? And they were. So in which case, here's the question. You have given the headline figure, you've given the RDEL, the resource figure, the CDEL, the capital figure. So why is it, and we've both heard numerous tales, why is it industry is saying contracts are just not being signed? Surely, with spring statements and the budget saying this is your budget, here are your control totals, the MOD could be going out and, as one which has been in the press, signing phase 2 of the Global Combat Air Programme, which the Japanese and Italians are saying we were meant to have signed this in September 2025. What's your problem? And I think my worry is the longer the DIP does not get released and so forth, and actually then especially with the knock-on effects of the Iran war, I don't rule out the defence budget actually being cut.
Well, I mean, there's lots of scuttlebutt going around about how the defence investment plan didn't land very well with the Treasury before Christmas, which when it was presented by the MOD, Secretary of State John Healey and the senior officials to the Treasury and the Prime Minister. And this gets to the nub of the peculiar British government system where you have obviously top-level announcements about spending commitments and all that kind of stuff, but you have the day-to-day control over when money is actually spent, actually signing the check, so to speak, resides with the Treasury, and it harbours that power. It just refuses to give it up. It refuses to delegate power to spend money when every other part of the government agrees that this should be spent. Because they can stop things, they want to just to show that they are in charge. And we had a very interesting issue about this a week or so ago with an extract from a new book about the inside Starmer government by the 2 Times journalists, Maguire and Pogrund, in which they talked about how the Treasury, Chancellor Rachel Reeves, has gone through a series of showdowns with her ministers and on a couple of occasions just walks out, refuses to sign things off, and as a result, nothing happens. And it introduces like systemic paralysis across whole swathes of the government.
And to sort of speak to those points, we have seen the embarrassment of the United Kingdom lacking a coherent layered air defence, ground-based air defence, especially anti-missile defence. And yes, Aster, as on board Type 45, can do a number of those missions, but not if it's tied up in Portsmouth. And the UK needs ground-based air defence. It was in SDR, Strategic Defence Review, that we need it. But somehow it's still, we need to think about this. And you're going with, actually, Ukraine ought to have been enough. Look at what is happening almost every night in Kyiv with drones, with cruise missiles, with ballistic missiles coming over from Russia. They want more Patriot, they want more IRST, they want more air defense systems. They at least have some to be able to engage the threats. Whereas over here, largely, there are, look, if Portsmouth's going to be attacked, if you've got 4 Type 25s tied up alongside, Portsmouth will be very well defended because it has the entire UK stock of advanced surface-to-air missiles. Clyde Naval Base, you can't defend Clyde Naval Base against ballistic missile attack from Portsmouth. Okay? You cannot defend RAF Lossiemouth from Portsmouth. The UK, despite what the Prime Minister said in front of the Joint Committee of the House of Commons yesterday, and where he said we have all the systems we need, we have layered air defence. The UK does not have layered air defence in a way that would be recognised by any other NATO partner. We have bits and bobs here. Are Starstreak and Martlet really good? Yes, they are. They're absolutely world-beating, head of the pack. Is Skysaber good? Yes, it is, very much so. But presently, we have 5 launchers. And remind me, Tim, where are those 5 launchers based?
Well, at least 2 of them are in the Falklands. One is used for training at Larkhill Royal Artillery School, which leaves potentially 2 launchers to be deployed anywhere in the world.
Well, I think one of them is at the logistics hub in Poland, where the equipment to Ukraine goes through. And we've both seen, though whether it's still there is an open question, one of them had been deployed to Estonia. Basically, you're talking about juggling 5 launchers. We're going to have 3 weeks in Estonia, and then we'll move on here to, it's not credible. And yes, they did order, was it an extra 7 or 9 last year?
August, yeah, last August.
Right? But as you know, they didn't order the extra missiles, and they've not ordered the extra enablers for those launchers to operate properly. Whereas I looked at France and Italy with Aster, where the Sampti, the ground-based version of Aster, the French went from, was it 6 batteries, of which they donated 2 to Ukraine. They ordered an extra 10 batteries, and the Italians ordered an extra 12, some of which will go to Ukraine. And then France also ordered, as the lead customer, the Elmika as a sort of gap filler. And from memory, it was 12 to 16 batteries. You compare that with the UK, we're nowhere.
Well, that raises the interesting point about the language that the Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary, and the Housing Secretary, who went out and used this form of words for the first time on the Koonsberg show on Sunday morning, they talk about there being no assessment of a threat to the UK. Now, that's a very curious form of words. In Whitehall speak, that means the Joint Intelligence Committee, which represents all the agencies, intelligence agencies, Defence Intelligence, GCHQ, MI5, MI6, DSDL science boffins, they have not come to a conclusion about what happened during this Diego Garcia incident. Now, it's pretty obvious that to get to Diego Garcia from the southeast corner of Iran, it's 3,800 kilometers. And you do that maths the other way from the northwest corner of Iran, that takes you to somewhere over Kent, south of London. So it's not a big leap to suggest that there is a missile system in Iran that could potentially reach London, but
and also to as well to short circuit things, Tim. Okay, you're Iran, and you're firing ballistic missiles against the Gulf states, against Israel, and so forth. But you want to demonstrate that you can do more than that. And you look around and go, maybe not Akrotiri, because you're going to have to fly over quite a lot of Patriot batteries and so forth. But you want to show serious intent. And actually, Diego Garcia, that's a pretty good target to go for. Now, do you have to get a ballistic missile in the middle of the runway or on a hangar, with B-52s in? No. You could have the missile hitting the central lagoon of Diego Garcia, and you can just say, see what we can do. Now, you are 3,500 kilometers plus from the best launch position in Iran to Diego Garcia. Why would you fire a ballistic missile that could only do 2,500 kilometers, right? Knowing it would land literally in the middle of the Indian Ocean, leaving especially the United States and the UK going, that's pretty pathetic, wasn't it? If you are going to launch something at Diego Garcia, which, by the way, if you think about it, unlike launching an attack against Paris, London, you name it, launching an attack on Diego Garcia, the chances of significant retaliation are zero. It's just a piece of coral with an airstrip. So it is almost, a target for which there is no retaliation prospect. No one is going to up. But why would you fire at Diego Garcia a missile that will never reach the atoll? It just doesn't make sense. You would end up looking stupid. So people saying, well, there's no evidence that they've got a missile at that range. I think they need to look again. And you were talking about language. And I found it very interesting that in the Prime Minister's appearance in front of the Joint Committee of the House of Commons, of all of the committees, and he was asked about, ballistic missiles and attacks and whatever. And he basically said, people are anxious about cost of living crisis, fuel going up and so forth. We don't want to frighten them more, which was interesting because we have both, not speculated, better than that, sort of gone, they don't want to admit there is a problem. Because actually, with ballistic missiles, the problem is you have to spend money to come up with a defense. But for the Prime Minister to say specifically, we don't want people to get nervous, don't want them to get frightened and so forth, that was pretty gobsmacking.
Well, a few weeks ago, in January, I think, Sir Ben Wallace appeared in front of the House of Commons Defence Committee and gave evidence about the Afghan refugee thing. But he wandered off into various defence-related subjects and started talking about how the centre of government, Downing Street, Cabinet Office, are able to avoid spending money on defence. And he raised an interesting point. He talked about how if you control the threat narrative, you can control the incentive to spend money. And he made specific sort of references to how the man in the street can see the health service isn't working, or they can see that the schools aren't working, or there aren't enough police officers. But they can't see Russian missile stocks or Russian aircraft, or in this case, an Iranian missile attack on Diego Garcia. So the threat narrative can be controlled to say that's not a problem. And we can see that happening quite obviously in this current sort of past 7 days.
I don't disagree in the round with what you said. With the whole issue of, in inverted commas, ballistic missile attack in the UK, someone pointed me to the fact that actually in the first 2 weeks of the V2s being fired against the UK, mainly Southeast England and London, an active decision was taken by Churchill to say, we're not going to tell the public that we're being hit by missiles, because it was felt it was too frightening, to repeat the word the current Prime Minister used. But even after a couple of weeks, they said it was like gas holders having spontaneous combustion, and that was it. But after a week or so, there were just too many of these missiles hitting London, and they couldn't keep the narrative of, don't worry, it's just normal. Brackets, and I think we should also consider the number of electricity substations in the UK that have burnt in the last 2 years in this context. Do we believe that were there to be some form of drone, deniable missile attack on parts of the UK, that the government, the civil service, whatever, would be able to hold the line of, oh, no, perfectly normal. The hospital blew up of its own accord. They wouldn't be able to hold that line for even 1 hour. The reality check, you speak to the Eastern Europeans, you speak to the Baltic states, Finland, the Scandinavian countries, their public are made perfectly aware by their governments that there is a direct threat from Russia, but there'll be others. And so the public is used to the idea of making sure they've got a head torch with batteries, wind-up radio. But over here, the Prime Minister says, we don't want to frighten people. And I would just say, great, until the first long-range Shahed hits Liverpool Street Station at rush hour, and people will then be saying, what did you do to defend us against this.
That's for him to speak to. I mean, I'm sure as the weeks go by and the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee comes to their conclusion that they present the government with their analysis of this attack and present options for reacting to it, that will put the Prime Minister on the spot. I mean, they already have a lot of trouble with the OBR. The Joint Intelligence Committee might be another quango of civil servants that are causing the government trouble.
Well, and the last thing we should do, Tim, before we sign off, is mention the increasingly viral song, penned and then using online tools to anonymize the song, and then the apology from a student on the Intermediate Staff College course at Shrivner. And the first song was called "We're Dying in the First Wave," about how specifically the army, but I think the individual who believed as he was saying it's across the services, just completely unprepared for war. And actually, I think the said individual, who I'm led to believe is a junior major, where he apologizes for using hurty words, actually just doubles down on not accusations, but declarations of truth that the UK is not prepared for war. And you've heard the songs, Tim. And what were your impression?
Well, we're going to post them on our website, links to the songs, which are shades of a bit of James Blunt in there. I'd suggest that they're sampling some of his songs.
That's a good point. We'll copy James Blunt in.
But they definitely suggest a certain fatalism about the direction of the armed forces and about how they don't expect anything to change anytime soon. And one of the catchy phrases was "we're a little bit shit" in the song. Yes. And then it also talks about how the bosses at Army headquarters in Andover are not very happy. So
actually, sorry, boss, you don't have a sense of humor. And okay, one of the stories going around, so I won't quite use confirmation, but a very senior, certainly a 3-star, having been shown the original song, got in a staff car, went up to Shrivenham and basically said, "Right, tell me who did it, or I fail a lot of you." Were that to be the case, it just shows sense of humor failure has been massive. I'd say that the two songs are both very funny, but also highlight provable and proven facts. And if you've got a system that says we're having none of this conchy talk around here, that's not brilliant.
Well, I mean, it comes from the army, from army officers, but it's pretty clear that other parts of the armed forces have the same issues. And one thing that is bubbling up, and maybe the issue over the next week or so, is this Straits of Hormuz security naval force, and ideas that the Royal Navy could lead this force. That's not so they like to say that type of stuff. But then what it comes out is they're leading this force with a chartered oil industry support vessel with mine hunting robots. It doesn't sort of strike me as being a force that signals UK commitment to putting its grey ships in harm's way and is leading from the front.
And actually, the fact that HMS Stirling Castle, I think it's on trials in the channel, and those who don't follow the Twitter of Britsky, BRITSKY, who does immensely good work showing the availability of Royal Navy and Royal Fleet auxiliary ships on a regular basis. You know, a lot of commentary about how long it took HMS Dragon to get down to, even to Suda Bay to carry on loading up in Crete rather than Cyprus. Stirling Castle would take, here's one, Tim, which we covered when it was kicking off in 23-24. Bearing in mind the military situation, would you send HMS Stirling Castle down the Red Sea without an escort?
It would be pretty, I think the technical phrase is ballsy thing to do. Given the Houthis have got a massive arsenal of drones and missiles ready to fire on any enemy warship that they talk about entering their waters.
And as we covered in Defence Eye about Carrier Strike 25, actually, was it all of the Royal Fleet auxiliaries didn't go through the Red Sea? They went round the Cape of Good Hope because of safety.
And we had a massive RAF escort operation to sanitize the area while the ships went through. So, I mean, there's other things going on at the moment that makes it unlikely that that kind of force could be mustered for that mission.
So, HMS Stirling Castle, God, if I had to go around South Africa and so forth, I doubt she can even do 20 knots. You're talking 3-4 weeks to deploy. This is very much looking, when they got there, the cupboard was bare. And I would say, okay, traditional minesweepers, mine hunters, like the Sandown class and Hunt class, okay, they don't have sprint speed and so forth, but they're a bit more flexible than a former oil rig supply ship.
I mean, potentially, they could put this stuff on planes and fly it to the UAE or Oman and operate it from a shore base. But geography says a shore base on the southern side of the Straits of Hormuz is pretty much, number one target for Iranian drones, missiles, or even artillery to hit from the other side of the Straits of Hormuz. So that's even a more ballsy thing to do that. You can't even sail away or maneuver into the fog to try and hide from or the mist or the of the sea. So it is a very, very tricky scenario for anybody to propose putting ships in that waterway.
And you then have this other conundrum, and people say, with a degree of truth, could the Straits of Hormuz be opened basically kinetically without the US Navy and the US Air Force and whatever? Now, there is a scenario, because there are parallel universes and all this stuff. There is a scenario that said, if you have got full backing from all of the European NATO countries, but also from India, from Japan, from South Korea, whose navies are big and capable, could they do it on their own? And the answer is probably. As I say, there will be risks involved, but I would say what is not possible is saying we will do this with the Americans, because if you are trying to open Straits of Hormuz as part of a force with the Americans, commanded by the US Navy, you are de facto joining what the United States has done in terms of attacking Iran. And so you can't say we are innocents, we are non-belligerents and so forth. If there was a combined task force with the US Navy, you are joining what the US has done. And so you would instantly not be able to play the card of we're not belligerents.
I mean, there's serious questions also about the capability of the fleet that the US Navy sent to the region, to the Middle East. I mean, they have obviously 2 aircraft carriers, one of them which is now out of action for various reasons to do with
laundry-related reasons.
Yeah, exactly. So that's out the game. And you're looking at 7 or 8 Arleigh destroyers as the main surface units. And if you're trying to organize a convoy system and a picket from Kuwait to the Straits of Hormuz and out, you would need probably double that number of ships. And that's without still having to protect your aircraft carrier, do the Red Sea missile defense.
Sorry, Tim, your latter point is the one which still I have not seen anyone addressing. People are scrabbling around, going on Wikipedia, finding out about the Armilla Patrol set up by Royal Navy late 1980s, mid 1980s. What everyone is ignoring is the biggest difference between then and now is we're not just doing the escort around the Straits of Hormuz. And by the way, the range of Iranian weapons is back in the late 1980s. You could say about the time you got to Fujairah on the UAE's Indian Ocean side, you were safe. That's not the case now. The Iranians have anti-ship weapons which will go much further than that. But it's now you need an Armilla Patrol for the Straits of Hormuz, but also for the Bab al-Mandab and up the Red Sea. And so let us pretend all you need, one of those great phrases, all you need is 12 destroyers and frigates for the Gulf. You will certainly need 8 to 10 for the Red Sea, and plus oilers. And one of the other issues which navies are still, in the best sense, struggling to deal with. Okay, you have a frigate with, for the sake of argument, 24 vertical launch surface-to-air missiles. It is not impossible to see a situation where that frigate will fire 24 of those weapons, in a day, maybe 2 days. That frigate then needs to go and reload. Reloading at sea is still for vertical launch systems is proving difficult. And if the sea state is getting a little bit high and you're trying to use a helicopter and the VL tubes are doing that and probably knocking people off the decks. And so suddenly the issue of, okay, if the French frigate Aquitaine has fired all of its surface-to-air missiles, Aster missiles, or HMS Daring, whatever, has fired all of its Aster, where will you reload?
Well, those questions and the fact it's so tricky and difficult is probably why President Trump is now getting his mind into the space where he has to negotiate his way out of this mess. We've seen the various convoluted diplomacy episodes this week, the famous quote, he's negotiating with himself, but we'll leave that as it may be. But it's pretty clear that the US is looking for an off-ramp pretty quickly because of all those issues we've just highlighted about securing that sea zone. And unless you secure that sea zone, you don't bring the price of oil and gas down, and you don't get out of the political hole you're in. So it's one of those situations where you should have thought about that before you started it. But anyway.
I just want to throw one last thing in, Tim, is lots of talk about US Marine Corps amphibious ready groups moving to the region, the 82nd Airborne being put on high readiness to deploy. In inverted commas, the talk is this will be to seize Karg Island, up at the top end of the Gulf, the main Iranian oil terminal. Even if there was in inverted commas, an easy way to do airdrop, I don't think there is, even at helicopter assaults using Black Hawks and V-22 Ospreys, you are so in the engagement zone of the Iranians. Dare I use the word Gallipoli? It just strikes me. I think Karg Island may be a decoy. Personally, I would say they need to look more at Larak Island and Keshem in the Straits of Hormuz, further away from the center of gravity of Iran, but which would then give you a chance of minimizing fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, and drone launching bases. Has this been thought through? Well, I think we should leave it with the listeners to work out whether the whole thing has been thought through.
With that interesting conundrum, we'll sign off this week. Back after Easter, talking about whatever's happened then, because the world will probably be changed 2 or 3 times since now, that point in time, in the massively rapid news cycle of 2026.